Weapons, mainly for anti-terrorist, anti-insurgent operations in various parts of the world, but it's become particularly famous on the borderlands between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and also in Yemen over the past sort of 5 to 10 years. Now, I'm going to get out of that because I'm not entirely convinced that it's the right thing to do to show people killing people in a lecture. Because it doesn't look like that's what they're doing, does it? It looks like they're sort of, just a machine operating, almost like playing a video game or something. But actually what they're doing is tracking and using weapons in order to kill them, in order to take out certain kinds of targets. So this lecture is trying to talk a little bit about what are the ethical implications of these kinds of changes in technology and ways of conducting warfare. So that's what we're going to be concentrating on. And the idea is that this lecture gives you a bit of a sense of the kind of lecture you might have if you came to study at the at Queen Mary. It relates to material that we cover on courses like War and Security, but also on courses on global ethics as well, which I happen to teach in the final year. So this is what I want to cover in this quite short lecture. Something about the changing nature of war, the issue specifically of asymmetrical warfare, and particularly the war on terror or the war on terrorism, which has been around now for a long time, since being, as it were, declared in the early 2000s. Remote and robotic warfare specifically, as an aspect of the ways in which these anti-terrorist wars are waged. And then looking at how this then plays out for our ways of thinking about what kinds of uses of organised violence are right or wrong, just or unjust. It's a very long tradition of thinking about those questions, about under what circumstances it's okay to put armed forces out there and to kill other populations for particular causes that are seen as just, etc. There's an equally long tradition of thinking about the kind of killing that it's permissible to do if you're involved in warfare, who you're supposed to target, how killings are supposed to be undertaken. So, particularly since the Second World War, there's been very clear international laws around things like genocide, for example, the killing of civilians, for example. And having thought about all of that, I want to kind of bring us back to this question of, can the kinds of warfare that we're talking about when we're looking at drone warfare be considered just or not? And some of the arguments on both sides of that question. Okay, so let's start with the changing nature of war. The man with the red collar is someone called Clausewitz, who's very famous as being one of the most important people to actually look at the concept of war and really address what war meant and the nature of war and the parameters of war. He wrote a very long book, which he never actually finished. It was published after his death, called On War. And his work became a reference point for people thinking about war from then onwards. So he wrote the book, well, it was published in 1832. As you move through the 19th and into the 20th century, Clausewitz remains the kind of reference point for people thinking about what war was, what war meant. And he understood it essentially as a kind of duel in which competing powers, maybe two, maybe collections of powers, meet head-on. And he was very influenced by the Napoleonic Wars, where for the first time he had massive mobilizations of population to fight. So Napoleon famously raised the levy en masse, the citizens of France, to fight for him. And it really changed the nature of warfare in the 19th century, which previously had been a matter of some professionals, some elites, and certain kinds of systems for sort of raising armed forces in times of danger, but most people not fighting most of the time. On Clausewitz's view, then, war is about major powers meeting, about mass mobilizations of populations in great conflicts, and wars have beginnings and ends. They happen, they start with a declaration, they finish with some kind of peace, usually following the victory of one power or another. They take place in particular places, so there are battlefields. You know, war is not everywhere, it's at certain places. When Clausewitz was writing, you went to the battlefield and you fought it out. The battlefield was not everywhere. And people are fighting war uniforms. You kind of could tell who was on your side and who wasn't by what they were wearing. And if you think about it, that goes on being true to the big wars that maybe we're more familiar with, like the First World War or the Second World War, which some of you may have studied if you've been doing work in history, for example. So that's the notion of war as a clash of powers, as being a kind of contained sort of business undertaken by those that are wearing uniforms, with a beginning and an end. And it's very much a model of great power warfare, and that seems like, you know, a reasonable model to hold if you're talking about the middle of the 19th century through to the middle and late 20th century. Having said that, though, in some ways that was always a false story. And Clausewitz himself wrote about the partisans in Spain in the Napoleonic Wars, who now we would call freedom fighters or terrorists, depending on what side we were on, but who were basically local guerrilla troops fighting against French occupation in Spain, and who weren't part of a great power conflict, and who didn't necessarily wear uniforms. And if you look at late 19th century colonial wars, you find asymmetry, that is, it's not two roughly equal powers bumping into each other, but actually one very powerful power and one much weaker power bumping into each other in the explosion of European imperialism towards the end of the 19th century. So Clausewitz's picture was never the whole story, but it certainly did seem to capture really very significant things about most wars that were going on at the era he was writing and then up to the middle of the 20th century. Recently, however, people have argued that we are seeing more and more conflicts that simply do not match up to anything like the Clausewitzian kind of account. So we're getting a lot of asymmetrical conflicts. If you think about the invasions and occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq, the Russian invasion of Ukraine the other year, what's going on in terms of the involvement of external powers in Syria, for example, at the moment, they're all wars in which actually you've got weak parties and strong parties. Even if you look back at something like the Vietnam War, if you just looked at the sheer weight of technology and material power that the US had in that war, then they should have won. It was an asymmetrical war. The Vietnamese were much weaker militarily. But actually, of course, they did win. People with bicycles, as it were, won against people with bombers, which is an interesting thing to think about. If you think also about things that aren't called wars, so-called military humanitarian interventions, and there's a lot of debate about whether these are wars or not and what the rationale for them is and so on, but things like the bombings in Kosovo in 1999 to try and stop the ethnic cleansing that Milosevic was engaging in at that time, or the intervention in Libya in 2011, which some of you may just about remember. I have to always keep reminding myself of how short your memories will be in comparison to mine because I'm so old. But some of you may remember Libya in 2011, when again a US-backed coalition went in to intervene because of the ways in which citizens were being threatened. And then, of course, there's the war on terror or the war on terrorism, this rather amorphous thing that's been going on in one form or another since the Twin Towers were brought down, and that, of course, is a picture of the Twin Towers there in 2001, where powers with enormous amounts of military capability, not just the US, but places like Britain, which do have a lot of military capability, are involved in ongoing conflicts with other actors who are much weaker and who are not necessarily even behaving in the way that a traditional army or air force would behave. So there's definitely been a sense that the Clausewitzian model doesn't really fit with what's going on now. So let's look a bit more at this war on terror, war on terrorism. One of the things that a lot of scholars studying what's been going on in terms of this kind of warfare over the past 16, 17 years have noted is that a lot of the boundaries that traditionally had been seen as quite kind of clear between different players or different zones of engagement, etc., seem to be becoming much more blurred with this mode of warfare. So, for instance, the CIA is actually in charge of a lot of the drone operations in the Afghanistan-Pakistan borderland area. Now, the CIA is not a military organisation, it's an intelligence organisation. And it obviously works with the military, but that boundary between military and intelligence organisation seems to have become extremely blurred. Another boundary that's become very blurred is the boundary between war as a distinctive kind of activity and policing as another kind of activity. So the assumption has generally been that if you're doing war, you're doing one kind of thing. If you're doing law enforcement, you're doing something else. But a lot of the operations in that Afghanistan-Pakistan borderland area are explained as or justified as much in the terms of policing or of law enforcement as they are in the terms of war. So it's about people being guilty of something, of it being permissible because this person has committed crimes, or they're going to commit crimes, or it's about enforcing international law by rooting out terrorist training camps. So you get a language that moves between a straightforward military war language and a policing law enforcement language. Another thing that's shifted is the distinction between combat and assassination. So if you go back to Clausewitz, combat is something very distinctive. It's the duel. It's two bodies fighting each other, two armies fighting each other, which comes down to individuals grappling it out with each other on a battlefield. And it's interesting, if you look at international law, perhaps rather peculiarly, as long as the parties have a just cause or they're following the laws of war, that's kind of seen as okay. But going off and assassinating people has not been seen as okay under international law. But now what we're finding is that with things like drone operations, which are highly targeted killings, and yes, they do make mistakes and there is collateral damage, but nevertheless it is highly targeted, much more so than standard mass bombings of previous eras. You're actually talking about something much closer to you're finding particular people and killing them. Something that we might see more as like a mode of assassination than of battle, because clearly the people being targeted by the drones, they have no recourse, they can't fight back in any direct way. They're out of any reach of firepower, etc. And there's nobody in them anyway, so there's no pilot that's at risk. So you don't have anything of that clash of two people coming together or two bodies coming together that traditionally have been seen as part of war. And of course this also relates to the other boundary that's become very blurred, which is the boundary between the battlefield itself, where the fighting goes on, and what we might call the hinterland, the background. So when Clausewitz was writing, he assumed, yes, armies would disrupt the villages and towns they passed through and by, of course they would, but the battle would happen on a battlefield somewhere in some poor peasant's land probably somewhere, but it would be a separate space where the battle would be engaged. If you look at counter-insurgency operations in Iraq, if you look at drone operations, if you look at a whole range of the kinds of techniques of warfare that are being used, it's not clear what's the battlefield and what's, as it were, the civilian area or the background area, the area that isn't part of the battlefield. So that boundary is also highly blurred. And the other thing that's happened, which brings us back to the specific concerns of this lecture, is that you've had the development of technologies to suit these new kinds of warfare. So unmanned aerial vehicles, which are commonly known as drones, have become one of the technologies that has grown enormously, seen a lot of investment in it, become more and more technologically sophisticated during the course of the war on terror and war on terrorism. And that's invariably the case. If you look at it historically, technologies and wars are very kind of mutually related, and often technological leaps happen because of wars. So drones aren't only used to go off and kill people. There's lots of drones that are used in agriculture or that are used to bring humanitarian aid, for example. This is not unknown. So they're, as it were, intelligent flying machines that can do lots of different stuff. And the fact they've been involved in war has meant enormous amounts of investment has gone into them, so that they're more and more sophisticated, more able to do other things. So it's quite an interesting question. You know, in 10 years' time, when we hear the word drones, we'll be thinking more about peaceful and constructive uses they get put to. A bit like aluminium saucepans and space flight, although I've never quite understood the exact link between those things. But I was always told as a child that things like going to the moon was justified because the technological developments that happened through getting people into space could then be, as it were, generalised into other contexts, and one of them was saucepans. Okay. So let's then come, supposing we kind of accept there's been this kind of shift, we've got changes in technologies, we've got changes in the form that warfare is taking, we've got these highly asymmetrical conflicts and all these boundaries being blurred and so on. So what do we think about the ethics of using this kind of technology as part of an ongoing conflict? And here I'm referring back to very long-standing principles that are supposed to govern justice in war, or that can be used to try and make judgments about whether wars are justified or not. So one of the things might be just cause. And in the past, just cause has tended to be identified, particularly since the Second World War, with if you are under direct threat of aggression by an enemy power, then you have a just cause to respond. And there's been a whole interesting debate around that as to whether, if you know an enemy is about to attack, even if they haven't actually attacked, can you take preemptive action? And in general, just war theory has said, yes, if there is a profound threat about to unravel, then you can. But what you can't do is to undertake preventive war, which is when you look at a particular power or a particular set of people and you say, in 10 years' time, these people are going to be really dangerous. Or at some indefinite point in the future, this set of people might be really dangerous. Preventive war has been something that's been seen as both illegal and unjust. So if we look at drone warfare, how is it justified? Well, it's very much about managing threats, getting rid of future threats. So one of the big debates here is it preemptive war and therefore justified? Or is it preventive war and therefore not justified, or at least maybe we've got to rethink under what circumstances we think this kind of war can be justified. Questions of legitimate authority. So in the past, states were the key legitimate actors in world politics who were entitled to declare war. Since the construction first of the League of Nations and then of the United Nations, often people see the Security Council as the sort of seat of legitimate authority when it comes to warfare. When it's a democratic state that's in question, people often argue about, well, should the population have given active consent to whatever form of warfare is going on? Now, this is ongoing warfare. It's very difficult to say exactly when it started or when it's going to stop. So that kind of complicates things anyway. But to what extent do, say, the US or their allies have legitimate authority to use this kind of technology in states where they are not actually in any sense formally at war with them? And here questions about the degree to which local governments are happy for this action to be happening become really crucial around the legitimacy question. And then we've got questions of last resort, which again is a classic thing that people argue about when it comes to the ethics of war. War is supposed to be the last possible thing that you do, having exhausted all other possibilities. So how do we think about drone warfare in terms of that kind of criterion? Is it a last resort? Does it get close to a last resort? Do wars ever get close to a last resort? So is it fake to suggest there's a problem with drone warfare as opposed to other kinds of wars that have gone on in the past and so on? And then there's the question of probability of success, which might sound a bit odd for an ethical sort of principle. But in the past, people have said, look, if you can't win a war, then surely it can't be right for masses and masses of people to die for an unwinnable war. So there's a question here about, is the war on terror or the war on terrorism winnable? And again, there's a lot of argument in the literature about that. If it's not winnable, then how much does that change one's views about the justice or otherwise of using drone warfare? There's another side to thinking about justice in war, and that's about justice in how war is conducted. It's not so much the things you need to take into account before you engage in war, but what do you do once you're at war? And the two key principles that have governed thinking about how you conduct war since the Second World War have been proportionality and discrimination. Proportionality is the goods that come out of the conflict must outweigh the bads, as it were, that follow from the conflict in terms of things like maybe civilian deaths or infrastructural damage or broader harm such as to political structures and so on. Discrimination is you're only supposed to target people who are fighters. Civilians are supposed to be immune to attack, and that's an absolute principle in contemporary international law. And these are just some examples of the arguments that go on either side of debates over this. So people arguing for the justice of the use of things like drones say, well, you actually get lower levels of casualties, even though there is some collateral damage. This is nothing like the body count you would get if you had an all-out boots-on-the-ground type of war. It's targeted smart killing. It's picking out the people that are threats. So it's not like the traditional Second World War or First World War, where, you know, lots and lots of people who weren't even soldiers but were called up and had to fight were slaughtered, and were in no sense clearly responsible for whatever it was going on. Those who defend the drone warfare will say, you know, what we're doing is we're getting to the people who are the threats, who are the bad people. It's a way of doing it. It's got to be justified. And also it frees the pilot from risk. Now, if you think you are right, then clearly it's got to be right that as far as possible you shouldn't suffer damage in delivering justice, in doing the right thing. So for some people, the fact that there is no risk because there's no actual pilot in the drone, it's remotely operated from somewhere in the Nevada desert, is a good thing. But then, of course, you've got the other side of all of those arguments. How smart is it? How are the targets identified? You can see quite a lot of these videos on YouTube and so on. I'm sure some of you have. And clearly, any kind of system has to operate with certain sorts of indicators. There's been an argument made that any men over the age of 16, for example, tend to be assumed to be combatants, assumed to be fighters. It's a very famous example of a huge massacre, not to do with drone warfare, that happened in the 1990s in Bosnia, where 7,000 men and boys were killed, including boys as young as 12, 13, 14. Not because they were a threat to the invading force, but because it was simply assumed that being a young man and being a civilian was somehow incompatible. So gender isn't always just about how women get situated when it comes to warfare. Civilian men often find themselves treated as if they were fighters, whether they're fighters or not. So how are the targets identified? How accurate is it? What about the collateral damage that happens? And then there's the whole risk-free pilot thing. You know, for Clausewitz, with his notion of the duel somehow at the heart of war, there was a kind of honour amongst soldiers. You know, they fought each other on equal terms in some sense. How do we think about the ethics of a conflict where one person is literally powerless in relation to the forces and cannot respond? There is no in the same time response possible. And there's ethical arguments that say this makes drone warfare inherently disproportional, and therefore it cannot pass the kind of bar for what counts as ethical warfare when it comes to the discrimination and proportionality criteria. Okay, so just some more questions. What's next? Killer robots? Question mark. It's not just drones. Computerized robotic technologies and systems are becoming more and more important to the way warfare is conducted. And this raises really interesting ethical questions. So, you know, if a robot goes in and kills some civilians, who do you take to court? The person who originally sorted out the hard wiring of the robot? The person who switched the button to send the robot off on that occasion? You know, how do we deal with issues of accountability and guilt when it comes to the conduct of warfare if it's going to be conducted by machines, as it were, at a remote level, without humans being directly concerned? Of course, for some people, again, robots are a good thing because overall they're much more reliable than human beings. They're much more likely to do what it is that they're programmed to do, and the argument is war will become less savage, less likely to result in major casualties and mistakes. And then, of course, we've got a whole other box opening up with cyber warfare. I mean, many of you will have heard about the possible Russian involvement in the US elections, for example. Many of you will have heard about the major cyber attacks that took place recently that people trace back to people in Korea. There's an argument that the whole thing about going out and fighting and using weapons is in a sense going to be completely passé, because all you need to do is to find ways of targeting infrastructure through cyber warfare. So again, if that happens, if all warfare is conducted in that way, and it's just who can manage to shut down our water and our electricity for long enough to get a population under control, then again, how does that change our way of thinking about justice and injustice in war, about accountability, about the ethics of war? So all things to think about. I have to say that we are not yet anywhere near a situation in which either robotic warfare or cyber warfare is the norm, but there are possible straws in the wind in terms of the way in which warfare is developing. Okay, we have a few minutes left if anybody has